Just got to get my mic going. Is it working? Yes? No? Okay. Well, thank you guys. That was amazing. That was truly amazing. It's true how the suffering is what kind of draws us to the Lord, isn't it? It's like when He gets us through or whatever. And I think both men kind of intimated well that God gets the glory even when things aren't going well, because we know where we're going and we know the end of the matter. And so I sure appreciate both of you sharing that. Glenn, you and I can talk about why you're aggravated with me later. But
it was an unfortunate choice of words on my part.
I want to take the last few minutes and just clarify some things I said last week, if you would allow me. If you weren't here last week, if you want to just hang out, we're going to have food fellowship in a few minutes, and we'd love to have you join us. So this week I had someone follow through courageously on my invitation to come and talk to me if anything I said seemed untrue, unbiblical, or offensive to them. You'll remember that as I'm preaching these current events and the so-called separation of church and state, I've made it clear, I hope, to everyone that if there's anything I say that's confusing or you misunderstand or you disagree with or bothers you, you have my permission to come and talk to me. And so I just want to deeply thank that person for bringing up a couple of concerns. There's really two reasons why I deeply appreciate their courage and conviction in coming to me directly. And it takes courage, right? It does take a little courage to sit down with the pastor and say, hey, I have some questions, right? So I get that and I appreciate that. And there's two reasons why. First, it keeps our relationship healthy, right? Just through intentional communication. I think that one of Satan's greatest tools, the bait of Satan, is for us to become offended. And then we back off from our relationships with each other, and those offenses then get shared with people, and the offense grows, and that's why so many difficulties take place in churches and homes and other places. So I am so appreciative that this person had the courage to come and just say, hey, I have some questions and concerns, and I want to talk to you about them. And that's why, because I want intentional communication to maintain our relationships. It takes that. It takes intentional communications. I have said many times from this pulpit, I don't know if you remember, but I've said many times that when you talk a lot, you offend a lot, right? And that's the bane of the preacher. So you think you're being clear, but you might not be as clear as you think you are. And communication's a hard enough thing to carry out to begin with accurately. And so I recognize that as a teacher and a preacher, and I say, it wouldn't surprise me if I said something that was confusing or easily misunderstood, or wrong for that matter, right? So when you talk a lot, you have to answer for a lot. That's why pastors are held to a higher account. The second reason I appreciate it is, I assume that if one person is thinking it, there's likely more that are thinking it. So it kind of guides me into saying, this should probably be addressed, even if it's one or two, it might be more widespread than I know. So by telling me their impression, they inform me of the potential need to clarify what I said. So that is what I would like to do for just a few minutes this morning before we end. So if I understand it correctly, they had two basic concerns as I understood them. And the first was that their first concern was that last week I mentioned Russia, China, and Saudi Arabia in my sermon. And I also mentioned Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, the leaders of Russia and China. And it concerned them that Russia, China, and Saudi Arabia, as well as America, are not mentioned in Scripture. And therefore they were concerned that my comments may be more opinion than fact or biblical. And I took that to be serious. That's a serious thing to bring to my attention, to make sure that what I am doing is reflecting the truth of the Bible. And I told you that I would seek to communicate when it's my opinion and when it's not my opinion. And I don't pretend to be able to do that perfectly, but that is my desire. So they were concerned that my opinion may not be, that it was my opinion and not necessarily scriptural. And I believe that's a valid concern, and one you as a church should always look out for anytime anyone preaches the word. You need to sort through what's opinion and what's scriptural truth, right? And so that always makes me shake in my boots, and so I always want to be careful. So first I want to clarify my main thesis to remind you of the context in which I spoke last week, okay? The first thing is, my point has been that one of Satan's means of corrupting the world with sin is by consolidating power, as proven beginning with the ancient account of the Tower of Babel and confirmed throughout history by man's attempts to create empires, okay? Such as Babylonian Empire and the Medo-Persian Empire, the Assyrian Empire, the Greek Empire, and the Roman empires. And each case, God facilitated their destruction. And so that was my point. My point is that Satan wants to bring us into a global community to consolidate corruption, and God's purpose is to actually keep us into national identities to keep evil in check. And that was one of the things our founding fathers knew. So these empires all sought to continually expand by taking over the sovereign territory of neighboring nations, okay? And all of which were ultimately dissolved and destroyed. That is why, as a side note, if you study the views of our founders regarding foreign policy, once the nation was formed, their view was one of non-interventionism. Our founding fathers believed that America should not be out spreading democracy all over the globe. And they gave a very specific reason for that, and it is this. They believed, and I believe, and I think this is true, and I think the Bible teaches this, that the change has to come in the heart before the change can come in the society. The effect of the gospel is personal, then corporate. And so you can't bring a democratic republic into a pagan nation that does not worship God, because they don't have the Spirit of God in them guiding their conscience, okay? So that was their thesis. You can agree with that or not, that was their thesis. So that is why if you study those views, you'll find out that they were not for all these different going into other nations. And our founding fathers had no interest in taking over other nations in order to expand the republic. So one of my main points last week was to show you that man's endeavor to create a global government continues to this day. That was what I was trying to communicate. That process is still ongoing, okay? That men are still trying to create a one world order or a one world government, and for the purpose of consolidating power, and God is resisting that. And in pursuit of that biblical truth, I mentioned the modern nations of Russia, China, and Saudi Arabia. And while the names Russia, China, and Saudi Arabia are not mentioned in the Bible, the regions of each of those places, though referred to by different ancient names, are everywhere encountered in Scripture. Those regions are discussed in depth in Scripture. So whatever they're named now doesn't necessarily eliminate them from the possibility of being discussed in Scriptures. And I did not make that clear last week. So that was not, I should have said that so that it was clear to you. And time doesn't allow me this morning for an exposition of those Scriptures, so I leave it to you to study those regions and their ancient names and how they each play a role in God's redemptive history and in the creation of ancient empires. I did give one opinion last week, and I did not preface it with, this is an opinion, and here's what I said. I said that the reason the modern globalists, the one world government elites, hate Putin is because he is a nationalist and not because he is a murderer or a communist. And I made that statement last week. That is my opinion. That is not scriptural. Putin is not mentioned in the Bible. And so I want to make sure that that's clear to you that that was my opinion. And I did not preface it that way, and I should have. The globalists themselves are murderers and communists. And so they don't hate Putin. This is my opinion now. They don't hate Putin because he's a communist or because he's a murderer. They hate him because he wants Russia to remain Russia and not be absorbed into a greater global community. That was what I was trying to say. And that opinion is mine, and you can agree with that or disagree with that. That is not a biblical statement. I want to just clarify that. That's really important. The second concern mentioned related to my comments about the existence of separate ethnic areas in our cities. I don't know if you remember me mentioning my dad taking us to the different neighborhoods around the Chicago area, or in Chicago, and how there were different ethnic groups, and you'd go under a bridge and you'd come to a new ethnic group. And the concern that this person expressed was that there's nothing wrong with ethnic groups seeking out communities of people with similar ethnic backgrounds, and I agree with that wholeheartedly. My point was not to say that they were bad for being in their own communities. If I were to go to a new country and there was a town or a community full of Americans, I would feel most comfortable there. And there's nothing wrong with that. And I may have miscommunicated that that was somehow bad. My point was not that it is wrong to desire to be in groups and neighborhoods of people with similar ethnic backgrounds. Rather, my point was simply that those coming to America should not expect America to accommodate or promote their cultures, but rather they should inculcate themselves into ours. That's what I was trying to communicate. Okay? Very important clarification. I didn't say that well last week. I just kind of got rolling. I'm not saying you shouldn't be in communities of like-minded people. That's a wonderful thing. That's a blessing. Where it turns into a problem is when they expect their culture to become prominent or primary in our culture, and our culture should be subordinated to their culture. Cultural cohesion is essential to a healthy nation, just as it is essential to a healthy family or healthy business. When I used to do consulting, business consulting, the first thing I would address is culture issues in the business, because the culture drives the community. So each family, just as an example, each family has its own culture which is unique to that family. Your family has its own culture. My family has its own culture. And if strangers are allowed to enter that family, and rather than adopt the culture of the family, they force the family to adopt their varied cultures, they force the family to adopt their multiple and varied cultures, the family that once was ceases to be. And that's true for nations too. So that was my point in bringing up the separate and diverse neighborhoods I saw as a kid in the city of Chicago. They need to be absorbed into our culture. They don't have to get rid of their culture. They just can't expect us to accommodate their culture at the expense of our own. That was my point. So I hope I've fairly represented the concerns of the person that came to me, and I hope that I have brought a little more clarity that I may have provided last week. So I own it 100% that I could have been clearer. And again, I thank that person for coming to me, and I encourage you to do the same so that offenses don't take hold and problems continue and an undercurrent of distrust develop among the body. So with that, I want to ask Craig, Brother Craig, if you would come up and lead us in prayer, and then we'll have one more song and meet for fellowship this morning. Thanks for your attention to that. Next week, I'm looking forward to continuing the series, and I'll try to be more careful with my choice of words. So.